The truth doesn't always arrive like a whisper. Sometimes it crashes into a man's life like a wrecking ball, tearing through every memory he thought was solid, every love he thought unbreakable, every identity he believed was his. 3 months ago, Fletcher Morrison stood on the balcony of a $4.2 million California home, convinced he was a man with a future. Today, he stands barefoot in the dim basement of his dead mother's Ohio house, staring at a hidden safe and a letter that rewrites every breath he has ever taken. The woman who destroyed his life was his wife. The woman who saved it was his mother. And the truth they left behind is about to drag him into the shadows of a 35-year-old murder, a crime family that never stopped hunting him, and a betrayal so personal it tastes like blood. If silence has ever burned inside you, stay with me until the final word. If you've ever felt the ground disappear beneath you, if you've ever looked at someone you loved and wondered when they became a stranger, stay close. This story will show you that even the deepest wounds can reveal the truth you were never meant to uncover. The first cracks in a life rarely arrive with thunder. They start as hairline fractures, thin, quiet, almost invisible, barely enough to disturb a man who believes his world is solid. Fletcher Morrison was that man. For 4 to 7 years he carried himself like someone who understood his place in the universe. Husband, father, provider, the steady hand who built a future with discipline and devotion. He lived in a home he once thought was the reward for every sacrifice he'd ever made, a house perched above California's vast sprawl, shimmering with the promise that he had finally outrun the struggles of his Ohio childhood. But even in perfect houses, shadows can slip in through unlocked doors. It began with small things. Cordelia, his wife of 18 years, the woman whose laughter had been the background music of his youth, started drifting to the edges of their home like a ghost. Phone calls she could never take inside. Late nights that had no explanation. An invisible wall forming between the bed they had shared for nearly 2 decades. Fletcher tried to dismiss it as work stress, the natural entropy of a long marriage. But the distance tasted sour. Cold. Wrong. He tried to bridge the space between them. He suggested dinners, weekend trips, quiet evenings after the kids went to sleep. But the harder he reached, the further she recoiled. Her eyes, once warm with familiarity, now scanned him with caution, like she was looking at an imposter wearing her husband's face. And in those eyes, he felt something worse than anger, contempt, the kind that grows slowly like rot. Their children felt it, too. Quinlan, 6'2", broad-shouldered, the future of his basketball team, stopped asking for rides to practice. He chose silence with the kind of instinct teenagers use when they sense danger they can't name. Brenna, gentle and observant, turned her drawings darker. Homes divided down the middle. Smiling families with shadows crouched behind them. Sketches that whispered the truth no one wanted to say aloud. Fletcher told himself families weather storms. This one, he believed, would pass like the others. He was wrong. The morning the divorce papers arrived felt eerily ordinary. The sky was clear. The coffee maker hummed. Cordelia brushed past him in the hallway without eye contact. He opened the front door expecting a package, maybe a delivery. Instead, he found a stranger holding an envelope that contained the demolition of his entire identity. The accusations were written with clinical cruelty, compulsive gambling, financial fraud, emotional instability. Someone had forged a different version of him, reckless, dangerous, deceitful, and placed this monster into the hands of the court. There were documents with his signature, bank withdrawals he'd never made, casino receipts from places he had never stepped foot into. Witnesses he'd trusted claimed they'd seen him placing bets or begging for loans. None of it was real. None of it belonged to him. Cordelia didn't flinch when he confronted her. She folded clothes into cardboard boxes with mechanical detachment, her face stone still, her movements precise. "What is this?" he demanded, holding the papers like they were burning his skin. "What it looks like," she said without looking at him. "You know this is all lies." She paused then, just enough to lift her gaze. What he saw was a stranger wearing his wife's eyes. Cold. Final. "You're not the man I married," she whispered. "Maybe you never were." That sentence carved something out of him. Something irreplaceable. The weeks that followed resembled a slow-motion freefall. Lawyers, hearings, statements, allegations. Every room he entered felt like a courtroom, even his own home, even the quiet corners where he had once held his children. Meanwhile, Cordelia's legal team struck with surgical precision. Every fabricated debt, every falsified withdrawal, every staged witness tightened around his neck like a noose. People he had known for years signed documents claiming he had become unstable. Neighbors he'd helped, friends he'd trusted, co-workers he'd mentored, each one folded under pressure or persuasion he did not yet understand. The lies multiplied faster than the truth could breathe. Even his kids weren't spared from the storm. Quinlan stopped meeting his eyes entirely, no longer sure who his father was supposed to be. And Brenna, his sweet, perceptive daughter, held her sketchbook like a shield, drawing worlds where father stood outside locked doors, reaching in but unable to enter. The custody evaluator arrived like a judge disguised as a therapist. Her voice was clinical, her questions sharpened with suspicion. She spoke to him as though the verdict had already been carved in stone. Fletcher answered each question honestly, desperately, helplessly, knowing honesty meant nothing in a room built on forged truths. By the time they entered the courtroom, he understood he was not there to defend himself. He was there to be dismantled. Judge Winters listened without emotion, her gaze unreadable. Cordelia's attorney painted Fletcher as a man consumed by addiction, a father whose deceit had spiraled out of control. Every accusation was supported by evidence tailored with precision. Every lie was strengthened by numbers and signatures that bore an uncanny resemblance to his own. His lawyer tried to push back, but there was nothing to stand on. Truth meant nothing when buried under a mountain of expertly engineered fabrications. When the judge announced her ruling, full custody to Cordelia, loss of the house, loss of assets, supervised visitation, Fletcher felt something inside him collapse. A quiet, irrevocable implosion. But the worst moment came outside the courthouse, where truths often show their teeth. Cordelia approached him with a smile that cut deeper than any knife. A smile he had never seen in 18 years of marriage. "You'll never see Quinlan and Brenna again," she whispered. "I'm moving them to Portland next month. And you don't have the money to stop me." Her eyes held no remorse. No hesitation. Only victory. It was then, at that exact moment, that Fletcher understood he had not lost a marriage. He had been targeted. Attacked. Ambushed by something far bigger than bitterness, far colder than betrayal. Within 6 weeks, the life he'd spent decades building disintegrated. His license revoked. His savings drained. His reputation shredded. He packed the remains of his existence into a Honda Civic and drove 1,200 miles east, to the house he'd grown up in, the house where his mother had died, the last place he thought he'd ever return. He believed he was going back to Ohio to hide. He didn't know he was going there to learn the truth. And he had no idea that the person who destroyed him, and the person who saved him, were parts of the same story. The road from California to Ohio stretched before Fletcher like a punishment, long, silent, and merciless. For 3 days, he drove through deserts, mountains, and endless plains, feeling as though every mile stripped away another layer of the life he once believed was permanent. He wasn't just traveling east, he was traveling backward. Toward a version of himself he thought he'd buried decades ago. Toward a childhood defined by quiet sacrifice and a mother whose strength he never fully understood. By the time he turned onto Maple Street in Akron, the sky was gray and heavy, pressing down on the neighborhoods that time seemed to have forgotten. When he parked in front of his mother's house, everything inside him went still. The home stood exactly as it had on the day they lowered her into the ground 2 years earlier. White siding, black shutters, a porch too small to hold all the memories it contained. It was the kind of house where doors didn't slam, where dinners were simple, where one woman held her entire world together with little more than careful budgeting and unshakable love. Fletcher sat in the car for nearly an hour, staring at that porch, feeling the weight of everything he'd lost crushed down on him. 3 months ago, he woke up in a master bedroom overlooking Los Angeles, sunlight spilling across a life he'd built from scratch. Now, he stared at a neighborhood where kids still rode their bikes without helmets, where everyone knew everyone, where his past sat waiting like a ghost. Eventually he opened the door and stepped out, the air colder than he remembered. His keys shook in his hand as he unlocked the front door, half expecting to find his mother standing in the kitchen with a cup of tea, humming the same quiet tune she always hummed when she cooked. But the house was silent. The kind of silence that settles on places where love once lived and has nowhere left to go. Her scent still lingered, lavender soap, old paper, a faint trace of cinnamon from her baked oatmeal. The living room was untouched, almost sacred. Her reading glasses rested on the end table. The last book she had been reading still lay open, the bookmark frozen mid-sentence. For a moment, Fletcher couldn't breathe. He felt like a trespasser. A man stepping into the remains of someone who had once been his entire universe. He dropped his duffel bag and sank into her chair, the same chair she used to sit in with a blanket draped over her lap. The tears came without warning, sharp and humiliating. He had held himself together while losing his home, his marriage, his career, his children. But standing inside the last place that had ever felt like true safety, that was what finally broke him. He stayed like that for days. He moved from the couch to her chair to the floor, haunted not by memories but by absence, his wife's absence, his children's absence, even the absence of the man he used to be. He slept in the clothes he wore, skipped meals, ignored the calls from his lawyer updating him about nothing. The only conversations he had were with ghosts, his mother's voice reminding him to get up, to shower, to try again, the way she had when he was a boy. Eventually, the fog began to thin. Not because things got better, but because the human body can only remain in collapse for so long before instinct kicks in. One morning, Fletcher forced himself to stand. Then he shaved. Then he made coffee in the mug his mother had left drying on the rack. That small act felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. But reality returned with brutal clarity. If he wanted his children back, he needed money. And the only thing he owned was this house. Renovating it felt like a mission. A purpose. A lifeline thrown into dark water. He sanded floors, stripped wallpaper, repainted walls, replaced fixtures. Every stroke of the paint roller felt like an act of defiance. Every nail hammered into place was a declaration, I will not disappear. Working with his hands reconnected him to the version of himself his mother had raised, practical, determined, steady. He played no music, letting the sounds of the house fill the silence, the creak of old beams, the thud of his footsteps, the whisper of memories too old to hold shape. He left the basement for last. His mother had always treated the basement like a storage vault, boxes of holiday decorations, old photographs, school projects she'd collected over the years as if they were priceless artifacts. Fletcher expected nothing more than dust and nostalgia. He didn't expect the first tremor of something strange. It began with the furnace. A bulky old unit converted from oil to gas long before he had graduated high school. It had always sat in that same corner. Everyone in the house knew it was practically immovable. But the concrete around it told a different story. Scratches. Fresh ones. Dust disturbed in unusual patterns. Scuff marks that didn't belong. He knelt down, touching the marks as confusion prickled at the back of his neck. His mother was barely strong enough to lift a grocery bag in the months before she died. So who moved the furnace? And why? The more he studied the floor, the more undeniable it became. Someone had shifted that furnace. Recently. A cold unease slipped into him. He spent the better part of the afternoon figuring out how to move the heavy unit inch by inch. Disconnecting the gas line terrified him, but determination outweighed fear. Sweat soaked through his shirt as he shoved, pulled, and leveraged the furnace away from the wall. The moment it finally scraped aside, revealing the concrete behind it, Fletcher froze. There, set into the wall, camouflaged by gray paint, was a small steel safe. Not new. Not modern. Old. Weathered. The paint around the edges chipped from years of use. A safe that had been hidden his entire childhood, behind a furnace too heavy for anyone but a determined adult to move. His mother. His quiet, gentle, librarian mother. Had been hiding something. Fletcher's pulse hammered as he touched the cold metal. His mind raced through 1,000 useless explanations. Old tax documents. His father's belongings. Savings she never told him about. But nothing felt right. Nothing matched the woman he remembered. The safe needed a combination. The dial spun from 0 to 99. 10,000 possible sequences. It could take days, weeks, to brute force it open. But then a memory surfaced. A birthday. A phone call. His mother's voice, soft, warm, unwavering, always calling him at the exact same time every single year. 7:23 a.m. The moment he was born. A ritual she never missed. March 15, 1977. His hands trembled as he turned the dial. Right. Left. Right. A click. A heavy shift of metal. The door eased open. What waited inside wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't memories. It wasn't even his mother's past. It was the destruction of everything he thought he knew about his own identity. Stacks of $100 bills, old, new, crisp, yellowed, neatly bundled. More money than he'd ever seen in his life. Multiple driver's licenses with his mother's face but different names. Social security cards belonging to women she had never mentioned. Birth certificates. A passport. Entire lives, documented and meticulously maintained. Every photograph looked like her. And yet none of them were his mother. Not the mother he knew. And beneath all of that, beneath the lies and the cash and the ghost identities, was an envelope with one word written on it. Fletcher. Not Morrison. Just Fletcher. The handwriting made him sink to the floor. It was hers. Warm. Familiar. A heartbreak pressed into paper. He opened it with shaking hands. The first line changed his entire existence. If you're reading this, they finally found you, and I'm no longer here to protect you. A chill seeped into his bones as he read on. His father hadn't died in a car accident. His real surname wasn't Morrison. His mother wasn't just a librarian. She had been a witness in a mob murder. A hunted woman. A survivor living under government protection. Every sacrifice she ever made wasn't just love. It was fear. It was strategy. It was survival. And every loss Fletcher had suffered over the past year, the divorce, the lies, the allegations, was not coincidence. It was a trap. A hunt. A plan 30 years in the making. Cordelia had been part of it. The mob had returned for him. And his mother, even in death, had left him the truth. And a way to fight back. The letter trembled slightly in Fletcher's hands, not because the paper was fragile, but because his world was. Words poured off the page like cold water, soaking into everything he thought he understood. Each sentence peeled back a layer of his past, revealing the truth underneath with surgical precision. Your real name is Fletcher Castellano. The name itself felt foreign. Heavy. Dangerous. Like something whispered in dark alleys, not spoken in kitchens filled with library books and birthday cakes. His father hadn't died in a car accident. He hadn't been just another man working a construction job. His name was Vincent Castellano, and he was murdered by the Torino crime family in 1989. The page blurred for a second as Fletcher's breath stuttered. He forced himself to keep reading, each word digging further into the foundation of a life that had never belonged to him. I witnessed his murder because I was supposed to die with him. Instead, I ran. I took you and I ran. His mother, quiet, gentle, predictable, had run from organized killers while carrying a 12-year-old boy in her grief-stricken arms. She hadn't just lost a husband. She had lost a whole identity, a whole life, and replaced it with lies crafted not to deceive him, but to save him. I testified before a federal grand jury. They put us in witness protection. We became Morrison. Not mother and son. Not widow and orphan. But fugitives wearing borrowed names. All the strange things from his childhood snapped into horrifying clarity. His mother's refusal to talk about the past. Her careful budgeting. Her sharp awareness of strangers. Her insistence on routine. Her quiet vigilance at grocery stores, parking lots, school events. The way she always positioned herself between him and the door. She'd been waiting for someone to recognize them. Waiting for the day the past would knock on their little white front door. He kept reading. The money in this safe is what remains of our government settlement, plus what I saved. But that is not why I hid the safe. Fletcher, I discovered too late that people were asking about us again. His stomach tightened. 3 years ago, I hired investigators to watch over you in California. They learned your wife was meeting with people connected to the Torino family. It felt like someone had placed a hand around his throat and squeezed. Cordelia. His wife. His first love. The mother of his children. Working with the men who killed his father. He whispered her name under his breath, as if saying it too loudly would summon a ghost. His mind reeled, every cold glance, every lie, every shift in her behavior. All the pieces he tried to interpret as marital strain snapped together like iron filings pulled to a magnet. But his mother's next sentence twisted the knife. I don't know if she knew who they really were, or if she was manipulated the way they manipulated you. That single line cracked open a possibility Fletcher hadn't allowed himself to consider. What if Cordelia was a victim too? What if the mob used her the same way they were using him, quietly, skillfully, without leaving fingerprints? The letter deepened that fear. The divorce, the fake financial records, the gambling accusations, they were designed to break you. To force you back to Ohio. They knew I might have left evidence behind. They wanted you to lead them to it. Fletcher felt his pulse roar in his ears. He hadn't come to Ohio because he was defeated. He had been herded here. Driven across the country like prey. Tricked into returning to the one place the mob hadn't been able to find for decades. The furnace. The safe. The house. All of it had been bait. And he had walked straight into the trap. He swallowed hard and forced himself to read the final lines. There is a name at the bottom of this letter. Call him immediately. He is the only one you can trust. Marshal Theodore Vance. Tell him you're ready to finish what we started. The words blurred again, and he clutched the letter like it was a lifeline. His mother wasn't just leaving him the truth, she was giving him a weapon. A direction. A final act of protection for the son she had saved twice. He dialed the number before fear could catch up to him. The voice on the other end was deep, steady, weary. "Vance. Marshall Vance, my name is Fletcher Morrison." He paused, forcing air into his lungs. "I think my real name is Fletcher Castellano." Silence. A long one. One that meant recognition. Then, "Son. I've been waiting for that call since the day your mother died. Where are you?" "Her house. The safe. Don't touch anything. Don't leave. And don't talk to anyone. I'll be there in 4 hours." The line went dead. Fletcher stayed in the basement, sitting beside the open safe, afraid that if he blinked the truth would vanish. When the knock on the door came hours later, it wasn't a polite tap. It was the knock of men who had no time for hesitation. 3 federal agents entered the house with the authority of people who'd spent decades hunting predators. And behind them stood Marshall Theodore Vance, a tall man in his early 60s with storm gray hair and the eyes of someone who carried histories too heavy to speak about casually. Vance took one look at the open safe and exhaled, as though releasing a breath he had been holding for far too long. "Your mother was smarter than all of us," he murmured. "I knew she left something behind." For 6 straight hours, the agents photographed documents, logged identities, reviewed the cash, and asked Fletcher questions that made his head spin. They weren't surprised by the aliases, or the money, or even the letter. But what they told him next froze his blood. The Torino crime family had never stopped looking for the remaining witnesses of Vincent Castellano's murder. They had simply become more sophisticated. Where bullets once solved their problems, now they used manipulation, financial sabotage, fake evidence, and emotional destruction. They didn't kill witnesses anymore, they erased them. One by one. Quietly. Efficiently. And Fletcher was the last one left. "Your wife was compromised," Vance said quietly as they sat at his mother's kitchen table. "Not willingly at first. They groomed her. Fed her lies. Gave her fake evidence about you. Frightened her. Promised her security." Fletcher's chest tightened painfully. "They made her believe," Vance continued, "that you were gambling. Cheating. Hiding money. They told her you were dangerous and would take the kids from her. They used her fear as leverage. Then they used her anger." Fletcher ran a hand over his face, feeling something between rage, grief, and pity. "So she was manipulated." "In every way that mattered," Vance replied. "She's a victim of them. Just like you." The world spun. His wife, his betrayer, had been betrayed long before she turned on him. That night, while agents combed through the basement, Vance revealed another truth. They had been watching the house ever since his mother died. "Your mother was worried they'd eventually find you," Vance said. "She asked us to keep an eye on the property, just in case. When you showed up, we knew something had gone wrong." And something had. Something massive. At dawn, Vance took a call outside the house. He returned with a grim expression. "Cordelia's been arrested," he said. "We picked her up in Portland along with 3 men connected to the Torino family." Fletcher felt the breath leave his lungs. "She's cooperating," Vance added. "She didn't know who they were, not at first. They fed her the lies you found. They manipulated her into helping them destroy your life. She never understood it was the mob." The truth struck Fletcher like a blow. Cordelia had helped ruin him. But she hadn't done it out of hatred. She'd done it out of fear. And ignorance. And the belief that she was protecting herself and her children. Everything inside him felt torn open. By the time the sun rose fully, the house that had once belonged to his mother felt like a crime scene, a sanctuary, and a battleground all at once. And Fletcher Castellano, stood at the center of it, holding the truth his mother had hidden for 30 years. A truth powerful enough to destroy the men who had hunted his family. A truth heavy enough to save his children. A truth dark enough to rewrite his destiny. He wasn't just a man who had been betrayed. He was a man who had been targeted since childhood. The past had finally found him. But this time, he wasn't running. By the time morning light crept through the thin curtains of his mother's old kitchen, Fletcher felt like he was living inside the echo of someone else's nightmare. Federal agents whispered into radios. Marshall Vance stood by the window, arms folded, watching the empty street with the caution of a man who had spent decades expecting bullets from unexpected directions. The house, once the soft cradle of Fletcher's childhood, had become a battlefield disguised as a home. But the war had started long before he returned to Ohio. And now, finally, the enemy had a face. Cordelia's arrest hit Fletcher with the blunt force of a car crash. All night, the agents had dug through the evidence his mother left behind. And just before dawn, Vance received confirmation. She had been detained in Portland along with 3 men tied directly to the Torino crime family. They've been circling her for years, Vance explained, his voice gravel low. They approached her like legitimate investors. Gave her opportunities. Made her trust them. Slowly walked her into their world. Fletcher's jaw tightened. She met them willingly, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Willingly at first, Vance replied. But by the time she realized they weren't who they claimed to be, it was too late. Fear is a leash, son. They used it well. He wanted to be angry, furious even, but the truth tangled in his chest. Cordelia had been the architect of his downfall, yet she had been a victim long before she became the instrument of his destruction. That didn't erase the pain. But it shifted the shape of it. Vance pulled out a folder thick with surveillance photos, dates, documents, financial records. Fletcher stared as image after image slid across the table. Cordelia sitting with strangers at a hotel bar. Cordelia accepting envelopes. Cordelia crying in her car after one of those meetings, the picture circled in red to emphasize the fear in her expression. They told her you were stealing, Vance murmured. That you were gambling behind her back. They showed her forged evidence. They set you up so she'd lose trust in you, and they set her up so you'd never believe she was manipulated. He pushed the final photograph across the table. Cordelia meeting with a man Fletcher recognized instantly from crime documentaries. Anthony Torino. The son of the man who had murdered Fletcher's father. The man who had been hunting Fletcher since childhood. Fletcher felt something cold move through him, rage, grief, disgust, and shock blending into something sharp and crystalline. This picture is 2 years old, Vance said. They were already using her before she even realized they had a name. Fletcher stared at the photo until his vision blurred. He remembered the way Cordelia had avoided his touch. The way she took calls in the other room. The way her eyes shifted from warm to wary. He had assumed she was falling out of love. He didn't realize she was drowning in lies. And the mob had used her fear to destroy her marriage, and him. The agents continued digging through the basement and the safe, documenting each piece of his mother's secret life. Fletcher stayed upstairs with Vance, drinking coffee that tasted bitter from grief. You said the Torino family has done this before, Fletcher whispered. Vance nodded. 6 times. 6 witnesses who testified in the 90s. Not one was killed. Not one was found dead. Instead, their marriages fell apart. Their finances destroyed. Their reputations shredded. A slow erasure. The kind that looks like self-destruction, not murder. Why not kill them? Vance's voice hardened. Because the FBI watches when witnesses die. But when a man loses his job, his family, his sanity, no one opens a case file. It's the perfect crime. Fletcher rubbed his eyes. So they wanted me to lose everything. They needed you broken. Isolated. Desperate enough to come back here. Vance nodded toward the floor, where the safe sat hidden below. They knew your mother might have left evidence. They couldn't find it. So they used you to lead them to it. And Cordelia. They used her heartbreak as the hammer. Fletcher leaned back, breath trembling. Rage burned in his chest, but beneath it was something heavier, sorrow. For his children. For his mother. For Cordelia, who had been caught in the crossfire of a war older than she was. What happens now? Fletcher asked. Vance's answer arrived in a grim tone. Now, we hit back. By the next morning, the operation had been set in motion. Warrants issued. Arrests executed. Safe houses activated. Cordelia being transported for questioning. Fletcher wasn't allowed to see her yet. Legally, emotionally, tactically, it was too volatile. But that afternoon, the phone call came. A quiet ring. An unfamiliar number. His son's voice on the other end. Dad. Fletcher's throat tightened. Quinlan. He sounded young. So young. Not the confident athlete who towered over Fletcher just months earlier. Aunt Jamie said Mom's in trouble, Quinlan whispered. Is it because of what I said? About you? Fletcher closed his eyes. No, buddy. None of this is your fault. Mom said you were sick. And dangerous. And that you didn't love us anymore. Every word was a knife. I love you more than anything, Fletcher whispered. More than my own life. And I'm going to fix this. I swear to you. There was a pause. Then Brenna's soft voice came on the line, trembling. Daddy, were you really gambling? Did you really steal money? The question broke him. No, sweetheart, he whispered. I never did any of those things. People lied to hurt our family. But it's over now. You're safe. And I'm coming back. She sniffled. Promise. Promise. He held onto that word like a lifeline. In the weeks that followed, the investigation exploded. The evidence from his mother's safe corroborated everything the federal task force needed. Cordelia, terrified and remorseful, told them everything. Every meeting, every document they pressured her to sign, every threat they made when she started to pull away. Her testimony didn't absolve her. But it saved her life. And it saved his. 6 months later, Fletcher stepped into a courtroom again, but this time, he wasn't a man on trial. He was a witness. A survivor. The final thread of a story that should have ended in blood 30 years earlier. He told the truth. About the lies. About the manipulation. About the men who hunted him. About the mother who hid her courage behind books and quiet smiles. By the end of the trial, the Torino family's operations were in ruins. Indictments piled up. Prison sentences handed down. The last link to his father's murder severed. Cordelia wasn't the woman she once was, but she wasn't the monster he thought she'd become. Therapy, confession, and hard truth carved cracks into her guilt. They wouldn't return to who they were before, but they would co-parent. They would heal what they could. And they would protect their children from ever learning how close their family came to being erased. Quinlan returned to basketball. Brenner's drawings brightened. And Fletcher, now carrying both names, Morrison and Castellano, found something like peace. But peace wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the life his mother had died protecting. And as he stood on the porch of her house one last time, keys in hand, boxes packed, the truth finally spoken, he whispered into the empty air. We're done running. I swear it. The house on Maple Street was nearly empty now. The walls were freshly painted, the floors refinished, the air scrubbed clean of dust and time. Fletcher stood in the center of the living room, his mother's living room, surrounded by boxes that held the last pieces of his childhood. Everything felt both heavier and lighter than he remembered, as though the air carried the weight of secrets finally released. He had come back here as a broken man. He was leaving as something else entirely. A survivor. A witness. A son finally carrying the legacy his mother had shielded him from for 30 years. But before he left, before he handed the keys to the realtor and closed the door on this chapter forever, he allowed himself one final slow walk through the house, every room, every corner, every memory. He stepped into the kitchen first. This was where she had made oatmeal on winter mornings, sliding the bowl across the table while the smell of cinnamon filled the room. Where she'd scold him gently for running through the house with muddy sneakers. Where she'd tell him stories of faraway places she claimed she'd read about in books, never revealing she had lived half a dozen lives before she became mom. He touched the counter where she used to rest her elbows while talking on the phone. He could almost hear her laugh. Almost see her standing there, tucking her hair behind her ear the way she always did when she was worried. He whispered, barely audible, I know now. Thank you. Then he moved down the hallway, pausing at his old bedroom. The posters were gone, the mattress removed, the walls bare, but Fletcher could still feel the warmth of childhood drifting like dust motes in the sunbeams. This was the room where she'd tuck him in after long days, where she'd kiss his forehead and whisper that he was safe. Safe. It was a fragile word now. But she had made it true for as long as she could. The last room he visited was the basement. The place where everything had unraveled, and where the truth had finally aligned. The furnace sat pushed aside, its position exposing the once hidden safe set into the concrete. The safe door hung open, empty now, photographed, logged, transported as evidence in a case that had shaken the federal system wide open. For a long moment, Fletcher simply stood in front of it. This dark steel box had destroyed the life he thought he had, and given him back the life he never knew belonged to him. His mother's handwriting echoed in his mind. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads you exactly where you need to be. When he finally walked back upstairs, the house felt different. Lighter. Not because the secrets were gone, but because he had stopped carrying them alone. Selling the house was a decision he made without hesitation. The proceeds were enough to start fresh in California, not the life he'd once had, but a life he was finally ready to build on his own terms. He used part of the money to secure a modest place near the kids' school. Nothing extravagant. Nothing with sweeping views of cities below. Just something real. Something grounded. Something that didn't pretend to be safe while hiding fractures underneath. By the time he moved back to California, the legal chaos had mostly settled. His name was cleared. His insurance license reinstated. The state issued a formal apology, stiff, awkward, insufficient, but necessary. The truth about what happened circulated quietly through the legal system, whispered between professionals like a cautionary tale. In the courts, he was no longer a disgraced father. He was a man wronged. A man vindicated. A man who had survived a decades-long hunt orchestrated by a crime family that had underestimated a librarian's quiet strength. The first time he saw his children again, he thought his chest would break open. Quinlan dropped his basketball bag and hugged him so tightly it hurt. The anger the boy had once carried toward him evaporated in that embrace, replaced with something raw and protective. Brenna cried into his shirt, whispering "Daddy, I'm sorry" over and over until he cupped her face and told her she never had to apologize for believing lies told to her by adults. They were his world. And now he was back in theirs. Cordelia stood a few steps away that day, arms wrapped around herself, face blotchy from tears. She was thinner, more fragile, her confidence cracked in places she couldn't hide anymore. When Fletcher looked at her, he didn't feel hatred, not anymore. Just a tired, aching sadness for everything they had lost to a war they never knew they were part of. She approached him slowly. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear to you. I didn't know." He nodded. "I know you didn't." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't reconciliation. It was acknowledgement. And that was enough. They would never go back to the marriage they once had. Too much damage had been done. Too much trust poisoned. Too much manipulated. But they would move forward as parents, bound by the same fierce love for their children that had once bound them to each other. Over time, therapy helped Cordelia untangle the lies she'd been fed. Helped her understand how fear had been used as a weapon against her. Helped her rebuild the parts of herself the mob had fractured. Therapy helped Fletcher, too. Not to erase the past, but to survive it. To understand that the fault didn't lie in loving deeply, but in trusting the wrong people. And even that wasn't his failure. It was the design of men who had spent a lifetime perfecting deception. The years of destruction slowly gave way to the beginning of healing. Quinlan returned to the basketball court with a renewed ferocity. Coaches still wanted him. Scouts still watched him. The pause in his progress hadn't extinguished his talent, it had sharpened it. Brenna's artwork softened, colors returning like spring after a long winter. She still drew storms sometimes, but now, she filled the corners with rays of light breaking through. And Fletcher? He became something he never expected, a man who lived in the daylight again. But he didn't forget. He couldn't forget. Not when the trial loomed like a mountain on the horizon. When he entered the federal courthouse to testify against the Torino organization, he wasn't the broken man who had once walked into a divorce hearing. He wasn't the confused husband begging for honesty. He wasn't the disgraced father fighting fabricated demons. He was Fletcher Castellano, son of Vincent Castellano. He was Fletcher Morrison, son of Wyford Morrison. He was the fusion of two lives, two identities, two legacies, one drowned in violence, one built in quiet resilience. He swore to tell the truth. And for hours, he did. He spoke about his father. About the murder. About witness protection. About the decades of silence that followed. About the manipulation that destroyed his family. About the safe his mother left behind, a final message, a final shield, a final weapon. By the time he stepped down from the stand, he felt lighter. Not healed. Not whole. But lighter. The trial ended with convictions across the board. Extortion, conspiracy, attempted witness tampering, falsification of evidence, and more. The Torino network fractured. The men who hunted his family were locked away. It didn't bring his father back. It didn't erase the scars carved into his life. But it ended the threat. Finally, after the verdict, Fletcher walked out of the courthouse and breathed a long, steady breath. The sky was clear. The air warm. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. He thought of his mother then. Her soft voice. Her tired hands. Her unspoken strength. She had protected him in life. And protected him again in death. He had finished what she started. Months later, on a calm evening in California, Fletcher sat on the front porch of his modest new home, watching Quinlan practice free throws in the driveway while Brenna sketched from the front steps. Cordelia sat in a chair nearby, keeping to herself, respectful of boundaries but present. Healing in quiet ways. The world felt fragile again. But it also felt possible. Fletcher looked up at the sky, no longer searching for danger, but searching for peace, and murmured, "Mom, it's over. We're safe." But somewhere in him, in the deepest place shaped by both fear and courage, he knew one truth more clearly than any other. Sometimes the people who love us the most are fighting battles we never see. And sometimes the worst thing that happens to us is what finally brings us home.